I will tell you today that it is good to be in a house of worship for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is we can bear one another's concerns and grief and sorrows. I just have to tell you, I'm not right yet. I'm still struggling with the events of yesterday, and it's inexplicable, except to try to let you know that without knowing all the particulars, I know that there has been evil in the world from the get-go. And death and tragedy just repeats itself time and time again. I guess the sobering aspect of this, for all of us who have had children, when I first heard, I guess it was yesterday morning, I heard a little bit about it, and you just, I don't know, you get desensitized to murders and violence and killings and innocence of people being taken. And so I just heard it in passing, none of the real details, just that there's a report of a shooting, and didn't pay it, as we used to say in Tennessee, we didn't pay it much mind. And then as the day wore on, I would catch news clips about it, and I began to realize it was much, much worse than I thought. And I guess the thing that really, we're all touched by different things. What really set me back a little bit, sort of stopped me in my tracks, was when I heard that it was an elementary school and the children were ages, and this is what got me, when they were 5 years old to 10 years old. And just that idea visually, as soon as that person said 5 years old, I conjured up in my mind's eye my 5-year-old daughters, back when they were 5 years of age, and just little pixies, running around in love with life, and just so much ahead of them, and they just sort of stopped me. So I'm struggling a little bit today, because I just don't, I'm trying to make heads or tails out of it. And so that's the reason why I say I'm glad to be with you, because you brethren are the ones who understand more about life and death and the uncertainty and time and chance than most. And it is within that context today that I would like to talk to you or give this sermon. It may end up being more of a talk than a sermon delivery. I thought about all the reasons why, and then I thought that's unprofitable for me to talk to you about, because I don't know all the reasons why. I just know that something happened that shouldn't have happened, and that it was, as I mentioned to you, another form of evil. I thought about all the particular reasons that people are going to come up with the following weeks and months and years. It's going to be diagnosed and analyzed from one end to the other, and they'll try to say this, and it was because of this, and so forth and so on. And it seems to me that in trying to understand the killer, we forget we forget the ones who are killed, and I think that is such a tragedy. The news, I will make this comment about it, those who are in the news are in a feeding frenzy, and they're all over it. I don't know if I really appreciate that. I'm just talking about you personally. I don't know. I do know one thing. I will give this as a blanket. I will say one thing that really concerns me is, and we have been aware of this now for a long time, is that our country, and I was in Canada last week, and it certainly applies to Canada, we are moving away from God's laws. We as a people, we as countries, are turning our back on God's teachings. And when I read what happens when you do that, these types of things are not to be unexpected, but they still are shocking. They are still very, very shocking. My prayer today, and I'm going to ask all of you, and I'll probably mention it again as I go through this, and certainly I'm going to conclude with this, I would like for all of us to be what I would call be prayerfully contemplative. That's I guess, two pretty good sized words. But do you know what I mean by that, to be prayerfully contemplative? When you When you think today, when you drive in your car after church, in our fellowship, to be mindful of those who are hurting, I'm talking about visceral agony. I don't know. I don't know what I would have done. I don't know. Tanya and Talia, they were 5 years old. They're all grown up now, and I immediately last evening, I just had to call my kids, and just so happened Talia was with us. She was over at the house, so I knew she was okay. So I called Tanya and chatted with her a little bit, made sure she was okay, and I said, well, how are those two cuties doing? McKaylee and Brooklyn. And McKaylee is 11 years old. And that's just 1 year older than those 5 to 10 years older. And I look at that little blonde gal and I think what could have been. Our country's broken. I'm just telling you, it's broken. Our churches are broken. And there is no justice in the land that I can see. And our politicians and our church leaders and our civil leaders, for the most part, not all of them, but many of them, are only doing what's best for themselves. And be damned to the people. And I don't mean that in a negative, I'm not swearing, I'm just saying that's the way it looks to me. And my heart is broken today. And I don't know if yours is or not. My heart is broken, but at the same moment, I have hope. And I'm not beyond grief. So talk to you about that today in the time I have. The title of the sermon is Unspeakable Grief. Unspeakable grief. One of the things I wanted to do right away, because I've never been in this situation, I thought it might be helpful if I could go online and find some stories from parents who had lost their children unexpectedly and try to get a hold of what they were thinking, because I've never done that. Never want to experience that feeling. So I went online and I found a story that was published by a gentleman by the name of Harold K. Bush, Jr. And he wrote this article back in December 11th, 2007, and this was after he had lost his son, Daniel. Now, things get away, time gets away from you. Apparently, from what the newscasters have said, this shooting is the second worst. The first being the terrible events up at Virginia Tech, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Does everybody understand that way? Where more young people, but they were older, were killed and massacred. So this is the second worst, what you call mass killing, recently. So this article by Mr. Bush addresses that a little bit, and so you just bear with me for a moment, and maybe we can get a hold of some of his thoughts as we consider what the Bible says about grief and lamentation and sorrow. He writes, when my wife and I saw the news reports about the deaths of young people, as we did when we saw the grisly report about Virginia Tech, we inevitably thought back to when we lost our son. His name was Daniel. He was a healthy, jovial, and playful boy, and all of a sudden, unexpected death was devastating. Because of our bereavement, our reactions to the deaths of children inevitably include a deep sympathy for surviving parents. We think about the horror that the parents will be facing in the weeks and months and years to come. It is possible to look at the parents who agree to be interviewed. It is impossible to look at the parents who agree to be interviewed and not to detect the numbness that accompanies them since the tragedy. And so we tend to think those poor parents, they have no idea how hellish their lives are probably going to be in the next few years. Parental bereavement brings about a crisis of meaning, and this is where I was really wanted to go at this point with this. Losing a child challenges one's view of the world, leading frequently into a kind of despair and a hopelessness. A child evokes a connection with our past. A child is a concrete expression of hope in the future. And when a child dies, much of a person's hopes die as well. He said, in my case, I wandered around in a hopeless trance for at least a couple of years, if not more. I did my duties, I taught my classes, and I graded papers, even went to church, but somehow I felt as if none of it really mattered very much. Days and weeks went around and around and around. One of the oddities of the research, he says, on parents who lose children is the differences in spiritual reaction that survivors can experience. Some parents turn completely and permanently away from church. They turn away from God and a belief of any sort. Others turn even more toward God and find the religious faith rejuvenated and strengthened. In other words, they find a purpose for it, for the death. And then there are some who experience a little bit of both responses. They seemingly deal with both increasing doubts about God and increasing faith, however strange that might sound. His concluding comments. One of the greatest consolations in my own experience has been the realization that I actually do believe in God. That's an interesting observation. I actually do believe in God. I have been reminded over and over of the powerful ending to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, where Jesus describes a storm. You remember this? Describes a storm hitting two different kinds of houses. One is built on sand, the other is built on solid rock. Solid rock I stand. That's one of my favorite hymns. Over these years, I've been thankful so many times to realize that there was a little bit of rock underneath my life. I suggest there is a little bit of rock underneath our lives. At least today I'd like to focus on that if I might. I'd like you to turn back to the book of 2 Samuel. We'll spend just a little bit of time here. Thought it might be helpful to look at how David dealt with loss, that fervent, energetic, dedicated servant of God. 2 Samuel chapter 1. And the parallels here are not exact, but I hope you will sense where they are similar. David did not lose children, but he lost two people who were very, very close to him. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and I want you to be seeing with me here. I want to begin picking this up over in verse 7. And I'll just let you know what's happened here. Saul is now dead, and Jonathan is dead. Saul, the king of Israel, Jonathan, his son, who was very, very, very close to David. Verse 7, and when he looked behind him, he saw me and called unto him, and I answered. He said, Here am I. And he said to me, Who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And what this is talking about, this is the individual who brought to David the message of their death, this Amalekite. A young man, apparently. So he said to me again, he says, Stand, I pray you, upon me, and slay me, for anguish has come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. And he says here in verse 10, So I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was falling. What this is talking about is this Amalekite who came upon King Saul. Okay? And so he assisted him in his suicide. If you really want to get right down to it, it was a suicide. I want you to see what the response is in verse 11. Then David took hold on his clothes after he had learned about this, and he was presented in verse 10 his bracelet that this young man, this Amalekite, brought back to him. And David then took hold on his clothes and he rent them. And I might say that that was a tradition, a Middle Eastern tradition, and in some areas it is still practiced, where the grief is so great that there's an outward visible display and people would rend their clothes and so forth. So David took hold of his clothes and he rent them. And I want you to notice also, and so likewise did all the men that were with him. And they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening. So there was a period of time when they didn't eat. And I would like to just say this to all of you. Did you feel like eating yesterday after you learned of such sadness and tragedy and such loss? I have to say, for me personally, my appetite was stifled. I wasn't hungry. I was prayerfully contemplative. I tried to be really truthfully, prayerfully contemplative of those moms and dads and those grandmas, grandpas, brothers and sisters, first cousins, second cousins, all the family member. all those little children. Tried to be contemplative of them and the sense that they were bearing, and my ability to do that was insufficient. That does not mean that I did not mourn, and today, although this is a house of worship, I would say to some respects it is a house of mourning in that we accept our Christian responsibility to be concerned for those who we don't even know, and yet we are touched by their loss. We've had a lot of mourning lately. We've lost our husbands. We've lost our sisters in faith, so we are well acquainted with grief, even as Jesus was acquainted with grief, and he was a man of many sorrows. It says that in Isaiah. So they mourned and they fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. I guess a little bit about where I am today is I'm also sad for our country. I am. I was chatting with Ann, who works at our office yesterday, and I don't know, you look at the changes, societal changes. When I was growing up, there were two things there were probably a lot of things off limits, but two things for sure. One was the young and the old were sacred. You never mistreated the young. Never. And you never, ever mistreated the elderly. They were off limits. And you didn't make jokes about them. You respected them. And I'm sad to say that's not true anymore. The elderly today are the most likely victims because you're so vulnerable. Just like a good friend of my wife's, who's not all that old, but you know, she's up there in Walmart, and on Walmart, for crying out loud, where you go just shop and buy groceries and get stuff. And you're not doing anything evil in there, and walks out and people target her. She's got her purse over her shoulder. They know that she's small and a little bit frail, and so they target her and run up there and try to yank her purse off of her shoulder and slam her down to the ground and bruise her and batter her, and then they run away, and they're never found. That at least when I was growing up, where I grew up, did not happen. I don't know if that's true of you folks where you came from, but where I grew up, and I'm not a person of vengeance, I hope you understand it. I've moved beyond my vengeance days, I think. But when I was in my barber getting my hair cut, I was talking to my barber about things, and I said, in my day, if somebody had done that, that young man or woman who did it would not have been protected. They would have been, may I put it politely, they would have been taken to the back and come out regretting what they have done. They would not have been mollycoddled. They would not have been protected. Now, please understand, they would not have been abused. You know what I'm talking about, abusing, you know. But there is a time for what I call out of the Old Testament a little bit of lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth principle. And today, I know it's difficult to administer, but I'm just tired of our young people, our little kids, little boys and girls, and our elderly being the victims, easy targets. I mean, just too easy. And it's tragedy. It did not used to be that way. Wherever you live, I hope that you do honor the elderly. And I hope that you are very protective of those young kids. Look over that. Hey, I know they're out of control, a lot of them. And I know that they probably deserve to have their bottoms busted, if you know how I mean that. Spanked a little bit. But you know, you can't even do that anymore. If you try that in school, you'll be probably sued. And let's be very candid about why they're being so careful about these investigations of these children, you know, that Apparently these little bodies are still inside this school, the classrooms, and they're still there. The parents haven't been able to even possess them and handle them yet. You know why, don't you? Because of lawsuits. Because there's going to be lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And that's the world we live in, unfortunately. And I visually try not to think about it too much, but I see those little bodies lying there. And they don't deserve that. They didn't deserve to be shot and killed, and they certainly don't deserve to be left there because of laws and suits and greed and so forth and so on. You know, when I step back, I'll say it again, our world is broken. And we are so far from the Matthew 5:7 principles that Jesus taught that it is alarming. It is distressing. Isn't it ironic, just a little sideline here, isn't it ironic to you that you cannot talk about God in school? Not any longer. You can't do it. If my wife talks about God in school, she will be fired. But don't you think it's ironic in that community up there in Connecticut that immediately, as soon, the first signs I saw is it said, would you please say a prayer? And what did they do last night? They all got together in church services and they invoked God's compassion and mercy. Isn't it interesting to me that where they need to really have God, He's not allowed? And we are surprised then that young men can grow up, and I don't know whether this person is physically or mentally, chemically unbalanced, although I suspected that right off the bat. I don't know the answers to that. But whatever it is, society has contributed to this to some degree. Evil and violence have been with us all along. It's just that this particular occasion, it seems to be so blatant, so deviant with little children. I think you see here, you know, how David was affected over the loss of two people that were very, very close to him. And he carried that grief on his shoulders. So today, as a congregation, and those who might be listening on the webcast, we all today carry a little bit of an extra burden. What has happened? What has happened to those moms and dads is that they are involved in bereavement. And the word bereavement comes, if you look at it, bereave. What does reave mean? Reave means to take away by force, to be plundered, to rob you. And that's what happened here. These families have been robbed of children who would get married, have a first dance, get to first base for the very first time, who would try to talk their way out of taking a bath, who would shucks mom and dad as much as they could and probably do a little pushing and shoving and, you know, yelling and all the things that little kids do. They've been robbed of that. Normal for those folks will never be what it once was. Normal is no more and never will be again. Here in this verse 17, it says in this same chapter, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. Now, I want to just stop here for a moment. Oftentimes, we spend so much time trying to figure out the reasons why things happen. And I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. You need to learn. But I think sometimes in doing that, we dismiss ourselves from the association of those who are suffering. You know, well, why did this happen? As if you can make everybody feel better if you can get a reason. Well, I don't know. I don't know if that'll make the parents feel any better. Do you think it will? And especially since it's probably unknowable since this young man killed himself. An observation personally for me, as soon as I heard it, what happened, the first thing I heard about is he shot his mother. And the last time I checked, that's the fifth commandment. My point I made early on to you is that our country, however, is being steered away so gradually from all of God's commandments. For a young man to take up a gun and to shoot his mother in the face, for crying out loud. I mean, that violates the fifth commandment, doesn't it? And then he goes waltzing over to that school, and he violates the sixth commandment at least 26 times. Those are violations of whose commandments? God's laws. I'm just trying to make my point. We've gotten so far away from where we could be. So reading on here a little bit, he makes this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. And I want you to see here, it says in verse 22, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. This was a tribute to them. And then in verse 24, ye daughters of Israel, he says, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the middle of the battle? And, O Jonathan, you were slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? Now, I read that because I think that David insisted that there's a sense of weeping and national mourning, and there needs to be that in this country, a sense of weeping and national mourning. And I do not say this without justification. Young people, college kids, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kid need to plug in to the real world. They need to weep and to mourn and to cry and to miss. Leave the violent video games alone. Leave them alone. Stay away from them. It's a pretend world where you push little buttons and you kill all, what's the word I use? You kill all these enemies. And you cannot be killed. Oh, on the screen you are, but you're not. You just start the button again and you get all caught up in this. Do you know what that does to your brain? Have you ever studied that kind of stuff? What those kind of activities do to your brain? So my appeal to any young people out there today, and those of you people, is watch. Please watch what your children are doing, because what they're doing with their heart and their hands will certainly find its way up to its mind, to their minds. I hope our children today can realize just how serious life is. But we won't. Let me just tell it like it is. We will not. And you know why we will not? It's because there's money to be made. There's money to be made. Parents are not at home with their children. Parents are off doing whatever they're doing, and children are left to themselves. And people think the children won't find their way to games of violence or movies of violence or impropriety. I assure you they absolutely will. They absolutely will. So maybe our young people can be reached, I hope. I hope. McKaylee, my oldest granddaughter, I was talking to Tanya last night. She'd already heard about it. The kids were talking about it. They have no idea. They have no idea what's really happened. They just talked about it. They have no real way of identifying with losing life when you're only 12 years old or 13 years old, do you? I don't think so. I want us to turn now to consider in John chapter 11. I'm trying my best not to be angry with society. That won't do me any good. I'm trying my best to be prayerfully contemplative of those who have lost so much here in the last couple of days, and also for our our society at large, which is, as I've already said several times, it seems to be broken. Here in John chapter 11, you're very familiar with this story. This is Lazarus, who is going to be brought back from sleep. You know, we've done a lot of funerals here lately, and every time I read this, I look out at an audience, and I see an audience of Baptists, for example, and they really do believe that that individual who we're praying over or talking about is where? They think he's up in heaven. And so I try to very politely and nicely and diplomatically and biblically use the language that Jesus used. And Jesus used the language that he was what? What's the language Jesus used? He is asleep. He's just asleep. People don't like that. I personally find it, I think it's terrific. I think, is there a better word to describe the state of the dead than they're asleep? The word selection here to me is just tremendous. So Lazarus is asleep, and he's about to come back to life. He's about to be awakened. You know the story, but I want you to see one little part over here in verse 31. It says, "The Jews then which were with her in the house and comforted her, when they saw Mary, that she rose up hastily and went out, followed her, saying, She goes to the grave to weep there. Then when Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Well, Lord, if you had been here, my brother had not died. Well, then when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit, and he was very troubled." Now verse 34, "And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see." And it says in verse 35 that Jesus wept. Now what I find interesting about this is that here Jesus is beside his friend Lazarus in the tomb, and he sees these women and he weeps. Well, wait a minute. He knows he's going to bring him back to life in just a matter of minutes. Have you ever noticed that? He's beside the tomb, and he's affected by all this that's going on around him, and he weeps. The Bible does not tell us how long he wept, does it? Do you have any sense of how long he wept? I don't. It just doesn't say, but the Bible does say that he wept, and yet, ironically, in just a matter of moments, he was going to bring him back to life. You find that remarkable story and event over in verse 43. "And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, he said, Lazarus, come forth! And he that was dead came forth, and there he was all bound up with his grave clothes. His face was bound also with a napkin. And Jesus said to him, Loose him, let him go. And of course, verse 45 says, Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did, they believed on him." Quite a remarkable event, wasn't it? This matter of grieving, I guess everybody does it a little bit differently. I personally do not grieve as someone who does not have hope. I try to grieve as someone who does have hope. And yet I've wondered, how does that show itself? How does that happen? What do I do? You may not be aware of this, but in the various cultures, they all express grief in a different way. The Egyptians, they dress in black for 6 months. I did not know that, but they dress in the black clothing for 6 months. Some of the Muslims will wear black clothing for up to a year. Orthodox Jews offer prayers for the deceased parent for up to 11 months. Now, I did not realize this, but in studying it, see if any of you remember this. I do not remember this. But apparently, if you go back a few decades, that here in America, it was not uncommon for those who had lost their loved ones to wear armband. Do any of you remember that? Kitty says she remembers that, to wear an armband. It was a sign that you were grieving. I personally have not seen that. Well, when I read that period of grief, it made me wonder if we in this society, which is, just so quickly moving from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing, if we move too quickly beyond our losses and we fail to grieve correctly. I think that we can prove from Scripture that grieving does take a little bit of time. I'd like you to see over in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and I want to read a couple of verses here beginning in verse 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 2. Some people are confounded by these verses, but really they're pretty simple. "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. What that says to me is that death teaches me lessons about life. That's what death teaches me, lessons about life. And so it's good to try to figure things out and to put an emphasis on what's really important and what is not important. I have heard consistently in the few little reports I've caught since yesterday morning, a number of people saying that they wanted to make sure they hugged their children a little bit more so than they had done. And I thought that was really good. Makes me also think about those statements we make to each other when we say goodbye to one another. See you soon. Have you ever, soon? I'll bet you that the parents of those 20 children would give just about anything in their power to have that morning to do over again, or to say things that hadn't been said that should have been said. You can just almost play those kinds of games, which can just drive you crazy. It says here, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the house of fools is in the house of mirth. When I read what we did in the gospel accounts about Jesus, I asked myself a question yesterday, and I would like to ask you this question today. If Jesus were among those folks this morning, what would he do? Think about that for a moment. If Jesus were among those folks, those 20 families this morning, what would he do? What do you think he'd do? It's one of those what-if questions that's not easily answered. Maybe we can find a little bit of a clue over here in Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. I want you to begin reading with me in verse 11, again, a section of Scripture that we are familiar with. And I don't mind letting Mickey know that when you lost Jerry, I thought about these verses, because they really did apply to you in a strong way. And I'm glad you're doing as well as you are. Here in chapter 7, verse 11 of Luke, it said, "And it came to pass the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and many people. And when he came near to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out. He was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow." So what do you learn from that? She had lost her husband, and now she lost her son. She had lost two close family members. She was a widow, and many people of the city were with her. And here's what I see in verse 13. "And when the Lord saw her," it says this, "he had compassion on her, and he said to her, weep not." And he came, and this is what he did. He touched that bier, or where they were carrying the casket. And they that bare him stood up, and they that bare him stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." I'm saying it very calmly. "Young man, arise." And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. It says there came a great fear on all, and they glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God has visited his people. Well, they were right about that. God had visited those people. So I ask you, wonder what Jesus would do if he were there among those folks this morning. Or we could even make it yesterday, but maybe today it would be just as effective. I know in my heart of hearts, that Jesus could bring every one of those little children back to life. Don't you know that? Do you really believe that? Don't you know? I hope you do, because he could. If you don't believe it, you better acquire that faith. Please acquire that faith. He can. He will. He does. He's going to. Now, what if he chose not to? If he chose not to, I still think he would make a very big difference, and I'm going to ask all of us in this room to try to, in a way, make the difference for these folks, even though we're not even there. I suggest that Jesus would go among the folks, the men and the women who had lost their children. They would be weeping, they would be crying, they would be mourning, and his presence among them would somehow or another relieve their grief. It would not take it away, but it would give them hope. Hope for something that prior to knowing about him, they would not have had. And that hope is, it makes no difference whether you are 5 or 10 or 20 or 60 or 70 or 90 years of age, that you will see those loved ones again. You will see those loved ones again. I started working my way through yesterday a possible dialogue that Jesus would say to someone as he looked maybe at individuals or even collectively. What would he say to all of them? I don't know. Maybe he would say he would say, I know you're going to miss them. I know you will. Because I made you that way. I made you. You were created to love that which is taken from you. And he would strengthen them. And I have a belief that their resolve, once they had rubbed shoulders with him, much greater than it was before he came among them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13 says this. I'm going to quote it to you out of the New International Version. And this is what it says in that translation. I think this fits very, very nicely. There is no need for you to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. Who have no hope. And that brings me back to the psalmist, to David, a man who wept over the loss of his friends, those with whom he was very, very close. Let me read to you a couple of things that he wrote. And just listen. Don't turn to them. Just let it sink into your contemplative prayer. David said, I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to sleep. I water my couch with my tears. My eye is consumed because of grief. Later on he wrote, For my life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing, and my strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones are consumed. In other words, he said he was wasting away from within. He goes on to say these things in Psalm 23. What does it say? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Psalm 121, verses 1 through 2 says this. I lift up mine eyes to the hills, from where will my help come? My help then comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. That's where our help comes. Unspeakable grief. It comes to us when we least expect it. I hope it never, ever comes to anyone in this room. I say unspeakable because some is expected. It's still troublesome. It's very, very difficult. It breaks our heart. It places a burden upon our shoulders. It makes us slouch because we carry so much weight. But we're allowed to stand erect and to have hope and to dream and to anticipate and to believe. Where do we look? Well, we look to the hills, from whence our source and our help comes. That's what the psalmist wrote. I would like to ask this audience today, this audience that's listening today, this is the Sabbath day. This is a day to be prayerful. This is a day to think about those who suffer, those who are struggling to make sense out of life, those who may even be wondering, does God exist and where is God? Well, God is well. and God is alive, and God dwells among his people. And today I call upon all of us here, myself included, to be contemplatively prayerful of those who have lost and suffered so much. And it will take a long, long time for them to move from where they are to where God intends to move them. I have a responsibility, and you do too, to pray for these folks. And once you learn their names, the names of the families, pray to God about them. Ask God to deliver them from their sorrow and from their grief. Allow him to move within them as if he were there personally, rubbing shoulder to shoulder with them, and some another lessen the pain, lessen the anguish, lessen the loss, because the statement that we entertained earlier really, really, really true. I will see you later. I will see you later. Those parents will see their children later. We are people who sorrow, but with hope. Let's remember those who have lost so much here in the last few days in contemplative prayer.